The dog was already dying when Garrett found her. She was wedged beneath the collapsed side of an old feed shed at the edge of Harlan Booker's property. The same shed that had been leaning at a dangerous angle for 3 winters running and finally gave up fighting the January ice. Garrett hadn't meant to be out that night. He hadn't meant to be anywhere in particular for the better part of 2 years. But his truck had fogged up on Route 9 and he'd pulled into Harlan's gravel drive to wait it out. And that's when he heard the sound. Not quite a whimper, not quite a cry, something in between, the kind of sound that gets into your spine before your brain has a chance to say no. He found her by the beam of his phone flashlight. A Belgian Malinois, maybe 4 years old, her back left leg pinned under a collapsed crossbeam, her breathing shallow and fast. Her coat was the color of dead winter grass, dark across the muzzle, and she watched him approach with eyes that were too exhausted to be afraid. She'd been there long enough that the cold had gotten into her. Another hour and she wouldn't have needed rescuing. Garrett pulled the beam up with both hands, and a sound he hadn't planned on making, the kind that comes up from the gut when you're lifting something heavier than you expected. She didn't bite him when he reached under for her. She just looked at him, and something about the way she looked at him. Steady, patient, resigned. Hit him somewhere low in the chest that hadn't been touched in a long time. He wrapped her in the emergency blanket he kept behind the seat and drove 20 minutes through the dark to Dr. Phyllis Odom's clinic on Cedar Mill Road. He called ahead. Phyllis met them at the back door in a barn coat thrown over pajamas, her reading glasses still on. "Malinois," she said immediately, lifting the blanket corner. "What happened to you, sweetheart?" "Feed shed came down on her," Garrett said. "Don't know who she is." Phyllis looked at him over the glasses. She'd known Garrett since before, and she knew the version of him that had come back from before. She didn't say anything about any of that. She just said, "Come on then," and they carried the dog inside together. Garrett Marsh had done 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before he made E7 and was attached to SEAL Team 4 out of Virginia Beach. In that life, he had been good at a particular kind of patience, the kind where you hold absolutely still and wait for a situation to resolve itself into something actionable. He'd been good at reading rooms, at reading people, at knowing the difference between a threat and a bluff. He'd been good at most things the Navy asked of him, until the thing that happened in Kandahar that he still didn't talk about in full sentences. He'd gotten out at 43. His wife, Carol, had waited through all of it. Through the deployments and the silences, and the year he slept 4 hours a night and wouldn't say why. She'd waited through his transition and his contractor work, and the slow discovery that he wasn't sure who he was outside the structure of a unit. And then 16 months after he separated from the Navy, Carol had gone to her sister's in Roanoke for a long weekend and not come back from it. An aneurysm, so sudden and total that the neurologist said she likely hadn't felt it. Garrett wasn't sure if that was meant to be comforting. He moved to Millhaven, Vermont, 8 months after Carol died. Not for any reason he could explain clearly. He'd passed through once, years ago, on the way to somewhere else, and the mountains had stayed in his mind as a place where the quiet was a different kind of quiet, not empty, not hostile, just wide. He rented a house on the far end of Sycamore Hollow Road, a gray clapboard place with a wood stove and a porch that faced west, and he settled into a life that was small by design. He cut firewood. He drove into town on Tuesdays for groceries. He ran the ridge trail behind the house most mornings, which was the closest thing to a ritual he still trusted. He did not have a dog. He had once, a lab mix named after a river he'd fished as a kid, but that was another version of his life. He didn't think about getting another one. He didn't think about much that required something in return. The Malinois had a chipped shoulder, 2 fractured ribs and moderate hypothermia. No microchip, no collar. Phyllis ran the usual checks and came back to the waiting room where Garrett was sitting with a cup of bad coffee, still in the same coat, hat still on, mud on his boots from the field. "She's stable," Phyllis said, sitting down across from him. "Going to need a few weeks. The leg wasn't broken, which is about the only piece of luck she's had tonight." "She's somebody's working dog, you think?" "Could be. She's trained, I can tell that much. The way she held still during the exam, that's not accident." Phyllis looked at him steadily. "You're not going to find the owner, Garrett." "I might. You might. but she's going to need somewhere to recover, and the shelter's full through February. She paused. I'm not telling you what to do. Yes, you are. Phyllis smiled just slightly. I'm asking if you've got room. He looked down at the coffee. He thought about the house on Sycamore Hollow, the particular shape of its silence, the way a whole evening could pass without him speaking a single word aloud. He thought about the empty dog bed he'd never gotten rid of, still in the back closet, still smelling faintly of the river. She's going to be a pain in the neck, he said. Absolutely, Phyllis agreed. He brought her home that Thursday. He set her up in the spare room with the dog bed and an old quilt Carol had made from flannel shirts. Her name, according to the tag Phyllis had zip-tied to her temporary collar, was Patient F, Malinois Mix. Approx 4. Garrett looked at that for a while. Then he looked at her. She was watching him from the dog bed with those same eyes, that same quality of waiting without demanding. I'm going to call you Vera, he said, for no reason he could identify. It had been his grandmother's name. She'd been a woman of very few words and great patience, it seemed to fit. Vera did not respond to this, but she also did not look away. The first week was quiet and procedural. He fed her twice a day, administered the antibiotics Phyllis had sent home, and changed the dressing on her leg every morning in the good light by the kitchen window. She let him do all of it without complaint, watching his hands with a focus that he recognized from somewhere. He didn't want to look at directly, the particular attention of something that has learned to assess whether the thing coming toward it means help or harm. You were somebody's working dog, he said one morning, cutting a strip of gauze. Somebody trained you, police maybe. Or before that. Vera's ears moved. Yeah, he said. I know the feeling. He hadn't talked this much in months. He noticed it without deciding what to do about it. By the second week, she was following him. Not constantly, not clingily. She wasn't that kind of dog. But when he moved from the kitchen to the living room, she moved too, settling at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate and far enough to be dignified. When he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee in the mornings, she positioned herself to his left, just slightly behind him, the way a working dog learns to sit without being told. Present, alert, not in the way. He started talking to her more. He told himself it was just noise, the way people leave the TV on for background. But it wasn't really that, and he knew it wasn't really that. He told her about the firewood he was splitting, about the deer he'd seen on the ridge trail, about the weather coming in from the northwest. He told her about Carol once, briefly, in a sentence he hadn't planned, and then stopped. Vera looked at him. He looked back. He got up and refilled his coffee. That night, she came and lay at the foot of his bed without being invited. He looked at her for a moment in the dark. Then he pulled the blanket up and went to sleep. He slept 6 hours straight, the first time in longer than he wanted to count. The person who broke the ice with the neighbors was Vera. Garrett hadn't made any particular effort with the people of Millhaven. He nodded at people in the grocery store, paid for his gas and left, waved at Harlan Booker, when their truck windows happened to face the same direction. He wasn't unfriendly, he was just sealed. There's a difference, though not everyone sees it. But Vera, once her ribs had healed enough for outside walks, had opinions about the world that differed from his. She wanted to go to the end of the drive, then a little further, then past the Okafor family's mailbox where their youngest, a boy of about 8 named Drew, was standing in the snow waiting for the school bus and staring at Vera with the specific longing of a child who has been told no dog under the current living arrangements. Is that a wolf? Drew asked. Belgian Malinois, Garrett said. Drew looked unsatisfied with this answer. Can I pet her? Garrett looked at Vera. Vera had already turned to face Drew, her posture easy, ears forward in the mode he'd come to recognize as genuine interest rather than alertness. Yeah, Garrett said. She won't mind. Drew petted her with both hands the way 8-year-olds do, thoroughly and without moderation, and Vera endured this with what Garrett could only describe as grace. By the time the school bus arrived, Drew had promised to come back the next day. By the end of that week, he'd brought his younger sister. By the week after that, Drew's mother, Adeze, had knocked on Garrett's front door with a pot of something that smelled like ginger and tomatoes and said, with the directness he'd come to understand, was simply her personality. We've been meaning to come over since you moved in. We kept not doing it. I apologize for that. Nothing to apologize for, Garrett said. There is a little, Ade said. Are you going to make me stand on the porch? He opened the door wider. Vera, behind him, wagged once. He found the journal in the back of his truck in March, wedged under the seat in a plastic bag. He didn't remember putting it there. It was Carol's, a small spiral notebook with a blue cover, the kind she used for grocery lists and phone numbers, and the occasional thought she wanted to write down before it left her. He sat in the driveway for a long time with it in his hands without opening it. Then he brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. Vera came and sat beside him, not touching, just there. He opened it. Most of it was ordinary, lists of things to pick up, names of plants she was looking up for the garden, a phone number for a plumber. But on the second-to-last page, in her small, slanted handwriting, she had written, G needs to remember that still water is not the same as dead water. Remind him if I get the chance. He read that 3 times. He didn't know when she'd written it. He didn't know what had prompted it. He thought about the version of himself she'd been watching all those years. The man who had gone very quiet and very still and called it surviving, and maybe had been confusing those two things for longer than he realized. He put the notebook down. He looked at Vera. She would have liked you, he said. Vera put her head on his knee. He sat there for a long time with his hand on her head, the afternoon light moving slowly across the kitchen floor, and something in him that had been held at a rigid angle for 2 years. Finally, almost imperceptibly, began to ease. April came, and with it the particular mud season that Vermonters speak about as if it were a sentient adversary. And Vera was fully healed and faster than Garrett had expected. She ran the ridge trail with him in the mornings now, not at his heel but slightly ahead, checking back every 20 or 30 yards with a glance that said, "Still with me." Which was the same question, he thought, that most living things were really asking most of the time. He'd started talking to Harlan Booker when they passed on the road. He'd started going to the diner in town on Friday mornings, partly because the coffee was better, partly because Vera was allowed on the porch, and people seemed to need to say hello to her, and saying hello to her meant saying hello to him, and that had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like something he needed without having known how to ask for it. He still didn't talk about Kandahar. He still didn't sleep more than 6 hours most nights. There were still mornings when the weight of everything he'd carried came down on him like weather. And he sat with it in the kitchen with his coffee going cold. But on those mornings, Vera came and sat with him, close, warm, unhurried, and he was not sitting with it alone, and that turned out to matter more than he'd expected. The day he understood what Vera had given back to him, it came the way most important things come, sideways, when he wasn't braced for it. It was a Sunday in late May, the kind of afternoon where the mountains go soft around the edges, and the air smells like something beginning. Drew had come over with his sister to see Vera, as had become their habit on weekend afternoons, and a Daisy had come with them and was sitting on the porch steps with a mug of tea. And Vera was running a long, lazy circle in the yard, with the kids in a way that made them shriek with joy. Harlan Booker had walked up the road for no particular stated reason, and was leaning on the fence post, talking to nobody specifically and everybody in general. Garrett stood on the porch and looked at all of it. The children, the neighbor, a daze with her tea. Vera cutting back toward him now across the yard at a full run, ears back, eyes bright, checking in. And he thought about the man who had pulled into a dark driveway 8 months ago because his truck windows had fogged and he'd heard a sound he almost didn't stop for. He'd thought he was doing the rescuing. He'd thought he was the one arriving, the one with the emergency blanket and the hands that knew how to lift and carry. He'd thought that was the transaction. He gives, the dog receives, the debt is settled. But Vera was looking at him now the way she always looked at him, steady, present, fully committed to the fact of him. And he understood, with the clarity of something finally arriving where it was always supposed to go, that it had never been a transaction at all. She hadn't been waiting for him to fix her. She'd been waiting for him to let her stay. And he had, reluctantly, the way a man who has forgotten how to need anything, reluctantly allows himself to need something. And in that reluctant allowing, something had been given back to him that he hadn't known how to name, and still wasn't sure he could. But it felt, standing on the porch in the late May light, with his neighbor at the fence, and the children in the yard, and the dog running home to him across the green, remarkably like the future. Vera reached him and pressed her side against his leg, breathing hard from the run, and he put his hand on her back, and she looked up at him once, just once, brief and certain, and then turned back to the yard. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Some things between a man and a dog get said without any words at all, and those turn out to be the ones that hold.